So in order to start working with 3D cameras, we have to really understand what they are and how they work, because I feel like a lot of people just don't grasp exactly what's happening when you start animating a 3D camera. Let's start by just talking about what After Effects is capable of. Obviously, you can do 2D animation inside of After Effects where you just have 2D objects. So let's say I wanted a circle. I've got a circle, right? I'll just make this 500 by 500. And there's a circle. That is a 2D shape. I can move it around in 2 axes. That's what the 2D, 2 dimensions stands for, X and Y movement. It's flat. There's no depth to it. I can style this however I want. I could shade it. I can scale it down. I can duplicate it and offset and animate these 2 shapes in these 2 dimensions. So 2D animation, no problem inside of After Effects. 3D animation, or 3-dimensional animation, is also possible inside of After Effects, but not to the extent that actual 3D software is capable of. Like Cinema 4D or 3D Studio Max, Maya, actual dedicated 3D software has a much more robust 3D interface and capabilities. So what does 3D inside of After Effects look like? Well, with both of these 2D layers, I can come over to these little switches. And if you don't see these right here, make sure that you have this little switch enabled in the bottom left corner that hides or shows the layer switches pane. All right, and then this column right here, which has kind of a 3D cube on it, that is the 3D layer switch. So if I turn the 3D layer on by clicking and dragging down on both of those shape layers, these are now 3D layers, but they look exactly the same. And that's because they still don't have any depth. They're actually still 2D layers, they just now exist in 3D space. There's the third Z axis, the Z dimension, is now unlocked because I turned on that switch. But again, it doesn't look any different, so what exactly happened? Well, if I select one of these layers, I now have these different colored handles for each dimension in this 3-dimensional space. So green for the y-axis, you can see that hovering over the arrow, red for the x-axis, and then blue for the z-axis, which is pointed towards us. I can click and drag on any of these handles to move it on those axes. Now, when I do this on the z-axis, the left and right, you see that it's actually looking like it's scaling the circle up and down. But what's actually happening is it's moving that layer closer or further away from us in 3D space. And to give you a little bit better perspective on what's actually happening, I'm gonna come over to this little menu right here at the bottom of my comp viewer and change it from 1 view to 2 views horizontal. That's gonna open up this second viewer for my composition so I can see my scene from 2 different perspectives. So I'm gonna click on this one and zoom in by pressing the period key on the keyboard a couple times. And you'll see in the top left corner here, we have the word top. That's letting us know that this is the top-down view of my scene. Over here is my active camera. The active camera is what you can think of as what's going to be rendered. It's whatever you see in the active camera view is what will be rendered when you go to export. But the top-down view is just showing us these blue lines. Well, those blue lines are the same as these blue outlines as I hover over either of these circles. It's just letting me know that there's an object there. So if I were to click on this bigger circle, we can see our 3-axis handles right here, and on the top-down view, we see them a little bit differently. Now, the Z handle, which is the blue handle, that was pointing towards us in the active camera view is now pointing down in the top-down view. If I click and drag on that, you see that it's moving it further away or closer to us in this active camera view. So this is the top-down view of our 3D scene. And if I were to disable the 3D layer switch for both of those circles, these are back to being 2D layers, and even in our top-down view, we're going to be seeing them exactly the same as the active camera view because we lost that third dimension. So let me just turn those back on real quick, and let's switch to another view in this top-down window. So I'll click on this top view to make it active. You can see these blue triangles in the corners letting you know that's the active view. And then instead of being on the top view, I'm gonna click on that menu and come down to Custom View 1. Now, these views 1, 2, and 3 are just preset default views that After Effects has set for us, but we'll go to Custom View 1. And what this view is kind of like a 3/4 angle up and to the left. So imagine you were standing in front of these 2 circles, and now you've kind of swung up and to the left, and you're looking kind of at a downward angle at our scene. All right, so now if I click and drag these layers around, you can kind of get a sense for the space that we're working with now. Turning on this 3D layer switch has activated that third dimension and is allowing us to move objects on that z-axis. But you'll notice these layers are still flat. They're two-dimensional. There is no z depth to either of these objects. And if I grab my rotation tool and just rotate around the y-axis by clicking and dragging on that handle, I can rotate this to a point where it's basically invisible, because this is a two-dimensional layer existing within 3D space. It's not actually a three-dimensional layer. So imagine it like pieces of paper, except the paper is so thin that if you turned it perfectly sideways, you wouldn't even see it. It would be invisible because there's literally no depth to these layers. This kind of 3D is sometimes called 2.5D because it's not quite 3D. We're working with 2D layers in 3D space, whereas a program like Cinema 4D can work with true 3D geometry inside of 3D space. And while it is a little bit limiting, there's still a lot of possibilities that working inside of 3D space opens up inside of After Effects. And as we'll see further along in this class, After Effects actually can work with some 3D geometry natively within After Effects, but also using some third-party plugins. Really quickly, I'm going to switch back from my custom view 1 to the top view, and we can see the rotation that we added to these two objects. Now, if I grab this one that we've already rotated a little bit and just click and drag it to rotate it even further, now it's at this weird angle where it's kind of angled upwards, and we can see that reflected in our top-down view. If I switch this from top to, say, left, now the camera has swung over to the left side of our scene and we're looking at it directly from the side. Or I could look at it from the right side and it's just going to swap around. And I can move around this scene a little bit. So let's say that I had this object way further back in the scene so that I couldn't even see it in my right view. Well, I can navigate around this a little bit using the camera tools. And we're gonna cover these at length a little bit later, but just to show you, I can click down and hold on this camera tool and go to my Track Z camera tool. Again, we're going to cover this later. Don't worry if you're not following along yet. But I can kind of zoom out on this view until I can see that layer. I'll press C to cycle through my camera tools until I get to this Track XY tool, which lets me kind of just pan around my scene. And then press C a couple more times until I get to my camera view. Let's say that I wanted to rotate around this scene a little bit, just move the camera around so I could look at it from a different angle. Well, normally with this camera tool, I could click and drag and that would happen. But in this view, I'm not able to do that. And that's because this is a fixed view. All of these views right here in this section are fixed. If you're looking at it from the front, you cannot change the camera angle. If you're looking at it from the left, you can't change the camera angle. But on custom view 1, 2, and 3, I can. So if I click and drag now, you can see that I'm kind of orbiting around my scene in 3D space. I can zoom out, I can track around it, and then I can orbit around with my camera. So hopefully this is giving you a little bit of an intro into how this 3D space is working inside of After Effects, even though we're working with 2D layers.